Because it is our final night. Thank you. It is sad, isn't it? But although this is coming to the end of this week called What If, our hope is actually that for many people it's not the end, but the start, at least the start of a further conversation asking some of these big questions. And maybe beyond that, actually the start of the greatest discovery, a journey of a relationship with God, as we've heard about through different stories this week. So although we're coming to the end, we hope in many ways it is actually the beginning. But tonight we're looking at this question: what if we were made for more? I don't know whether you've heard of this chap, Bertrand Russell. He was one of the most famous atheists of the last century. And he once outlined his view of life in the universe in these honest but perhaps bleak words. Man, he said, is the product of causes which had no provision of the ends they were achieving. His origin, his growth, hopes, fears, and loves and beliefs are but the outcome of an accidental collocation of atoms. No fire of heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave. The whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. He's a cheerful chap. That's Bertrand Russell. But actually, as despairing and depressing as those words are, I have to commend him for his honesty, because actually he was trying to be consistent with his naturalistic, atheistic worldview, which is, there isn't anything more. There's nothing more beyond this life. When we die, that's it. And because there's nothing more beyond this life, there's nothing more to this life. Because at the end of the day, if death is the end for me, for you, and the universe, what is the point of everything before death? Is there more to life? Well, no. I'll give you an illustration. Imagine if you were to realize that at the end of your time at Oxford University, we're going to turn around and say, well, actually, we're not going to give you a degree. Thank you very much for your £27,000 or however much you spent, but we're not giving you anything. If you knew that all of your studies, all of your work, all of those late nights, all of those exams, all of that revision was going to count for nothing, would you keep on revising, keep on studying? You see, if ultimately all of life is heading towards nothing, what is the point? So, of course, according to the naturalistic worldview, are we made for more? Well, the answer is no. There is nothing more beyond this life, and there's no more to this life than what we can see and touch. And I guess that's why many people, in fact, increasing numbers of people, and especially among your age group, are starting to ask questions like, maybe there is something more than what we can see and touch. Maybe there is more to life than can be accounted for by the naturalistic worldview. But of course, the question is, how do we know? How do we know whether there is anything more beyond this life or to this life? A while back, I was in South Africa with my wife on holiday, and I went down to this place on my bike, Cape Point, right down at the southwestern point of the African continent, just south of the city of Cape Town. And I was learning about this place because 500 years ago or thereabouts, no one from the European continent had ever been beyond Cape Point. Many people had tried, but all of them had failed. At this point where two oceans meet, it's quite treacherous, and so no one had been able to get beyond this place. Until that was a Portuguese sailor called Bartolomeu Dias. Sorry if you're Portuguese and I haven't announced it properly. He set sail from Portugal and did what no one else had done. He went beyond this place and came back from the other side. And up until he did that, this place had been known as the Cape of Storms. But after his successful voyage, they changed the name of it to what it's now called, the Cape of Good Hope. Because someone had gone beyond this place of unknown and come back from the other side and can say, there is something more. There is something on the other side. And then another Portuguese man called Vasco da Gama went even further and discovered for the first time as a European the continent of India and came back. They discovered there was something more because they went beyond and they came back. How do we know whether there is something more beyond this life and to this life? Well, actually, the Christian faith says there is someone who can tell us because there is someone who has come back, as it were, from the other side. There is someone who has come back from the other side of death. And that person, of course, is the person of Jesus. And we've been exploring this a little bit at lunchtime today. But tonight, I just want to read the account of that from these books on your tables. So if you just pick up the Mark books that are on your tables, we've been tracking through this book over the course of the week. And last night, we looked at the events of Jesus' crucifixion. And we looked at the significance of that and what that means for us. But that is not the end of the story. The end of the story is in chapter 16, and this is on page 43. By the way, if you've not got a copy of this yet, this is yours to take away. It's free. Please do take it. Do have a read. It's one of the earliest and shortest accounts we have of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. But let me read chapter 16, page 43. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so they may go and anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As he entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So that's Mark's account, the earliest account. And if you look in the Bible, we've got 3 other biographical accounts of Jesus, which give us some more details as well surrounding that for complementary accounts. Now, you might be reading that saying, yeah, but you don't actually expect me to believe that, do you? Because dead people don't rise. And we know that things like this are impossible. Maybe they believed it because it was easy in the first century to believe these kind of things. But can I? Well, actually, what's interesting is that, well, for a start, I think even though people in the first century had a lot less medical knowledge than we do, they still knew that dead people didn't normally rise. That doesn't take a degree at Oxford in medicine to discover, does it? But actually, more importantly, what we can see is that actually for the first followers of Jesus, believing in the resurrection was probably actually just as hard as it was or is for us, but just for different reasons. 3 times in this book, in this Mark book, Mark records Jesus before his death, predicting his death and his resurrection. He says 3 times, "I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to die, 3 days later I'm going to rise from the dead." Jesus goes to Jerusalem, he dies, and 3 days later we get to chapter 16, and what do you find? Do you find the women going down, kind of discussing, has it happened yet? Do you think it's already happened? Do you think they're expecting the resurrection? Well, actually, they're not, are they? The women are discussing how they're going to move the stone because they think that he's still dead and gone. And the blokes are probably still in bed. That's normally where they are. Nobody is expecting the resurrection, are they? Even though Jesus predicts it. And I think that shows us that even though Jesus said it, it was so impossible for them to contemplate that this kind of thing could happen. Now, it wasn't that they were atheist rationalists. They had a different worldview. But according to their worldview, the idea of a resurrection from the dead in the middle of history was just as outrageous as it would be for us. In other words, they didn't come to believe it because it fitted neatly with their worldview, but because they were convinced it was true. And actually, let me say, the resurrection of Jesus doesn't fit neatly with any worldview. It challenges them all. So what is the evidence? Well, if you were here at lunchtime, Sharon helpfully looked at some of it, but if you weren't, let's have a look at some of it again. Because there are certain strands that we can get, both from this and other documents, both within and outside of the New Testament, that show us a few things that we need to come to terms with. The first is that Jesus was crucified. That's not only documented within the New Testament, but in other documents outside of it as well. As one historian said, it's about the most attested fact from antiquity. Secondly, the tomb was empty. It would have been very difficult for the Christian faith to begin if it hadn't been. It would have been easy to disprove it if his body was still rotting in a grave. And interestingly, all of the gospel accounts tell us that it was women who were the first witnesses of the empty tomb, which is significant because in the first century, a woman was not allowed to give testimony in a court of law. And so if you were inventing a story, it would be a very strange detail to make up in such a way. Thirdly, the disciples were convinced that they had met the risen Jesus. And I say that because they not only spread this message, but almost to a man, they were willing to die for it. Now, you may die for things that aren't true, but you don't normally die for something that you know isn't true. So if they just made up this story, well, they wouldn't have gone to that length. So what was it that convinced them? They seemed to have some kind of experience that convinced them that they had encountered Jesus. Fourthly, you've got the transformation of the lives of Jesus' followers, not just those who had previously believed, but also those who hadn't, skeptics like his half-brother James, or an outright hostile opponent like Saul of Tarsus, who becomes the Apostle Paul. And then fifthly, you've got the explosion of the Christian movement in the first century. So the Roman historian Tacitus tells us that within 30 years, the Roman Emperor Nero was able to blame the Christians in Rome for the fire that he actually probably started himself. But that shows us very interestingly that Christianity had exploded right across the Roman Empire. And there were so many in Rome within 30 years that Nero is able to blame them for his own fires. What caused it to explode? So, of course, you then have to ask the question, how do we explain these features from history? How do we understand them? And actually, through history, only certain explanations have been given. If you can think of better ones, stick them on the Slido, and we'll look at them later. But here's one that some people give. Someone else died on the cross. That's often the argument that Muslim friends of mine will say. It wasn't actually Jesus who died. It was someone who maybe looked like Jesus. And so actually, it wasn't Jesus who rose from the dead because he wasn't dead in the first place. The problem with that argument is there's no contemporary suggestion of that at all. The earliest historical document talking about this is from centuries later. There's no contemporary evidence to suggest this. So from a historical point of view, no reason to take that argument seriously. Another argument is that Jesus didn't really die. Yes, he was nailed to a cross, but perhaps he kind of swooned, passed out. He was put in the tomb, he revived, and people thought that he had risen from the dead when he had only really kind of been resuscitated, as you might put it. The problem with that is, for a start, we know the Romans were quite good at killing people. They did execute a lot of people by crucifixion. Interestingly, there's no record of anyone ever surviving Roman crucifixion. There is one instance where a person was taken off the cross while they were still alive because someone interceded on their behalf, but they died of their wounds afterwards anyway. And you have to imagine, for this theory to be correct, that what happened was Jesus was taken off the cross. Everyone missed the kind of vital signs of life. They wrap him in yards and yards of burial cloth. They place him in a guarded tomb. And then kind of 3 days later, or somewhere in between, Jesus kind of just wakes up. And then he unravels himself from all of the burial cloths, and then he ravels them all up again. And then he pushes away this big stone, and then he runs past the Roman guards, and then he washes off his blood and finds some clothes from a passerby and appears in a locked room to his scared disciples and manages to convince them that he is actually the Lord of history who's conquered death and that they should be willing to die for. Whereas actually, if someone had been crucified, they wouldn't have been able to walk, let alone pull off a feat like that. It takes a lot of imagination, doesn't it, to try and think about what would have had to have happened. Here's the third argument. The women went to the wrong tomb. Someone once said to me, well, women are bad at directions. And I'm like, seriously? Actually, my wife is an airline pilot. She is much better at directions than I am, which is good. You'll be glad to know. And you'd also have to consider that the men also went to the wrong tomb when they went to check out the women's report of the empty tomb. And if you've ever buried someone, by the way, you don't normally forget where you buried them, do you? That will be indelibly linked into your brain. And also, you'd have to imagine that what would have happened, therefore, would have been a few days later, the followers of Jesus, they stand up in the very city where all these events took place. And one of them, a guy called Peter, stands up and says, hey guys, you know Jesus, whom you crucified? He's alive. And someone from the back of the crowd would have shouted out, oi, Peter, you idiots! I think you guys went to the wrong tomb. That was Uncle John's tomb. They moved his body months ago. Jesus' tomb is over there, you numpty. Everyone would have had a good laugh. The Christians would have looked stupid. The Christian movement would have lasted 40 days. It wouldn't have happened, would it? What about this? Maybe the body was moved. But I guess you have to ask the question, moved by who? By grave robbers? Well, why would they break into a guarded tomb of a naked, penniless preacher and leave the only thing of value behind, the grave clothes? The authorities? Well, they maybe had access to the body. But of course, why would they want to? And if they had, for whatever reason, why didn't they produce it when this myth of resurrection started being propagated and spread? They would have every reason to wanting to stop it and every possibility to do so. Or you could suggest, well, maybe it was the followers of Jesus, the disciples. They would have had perhaps a motive. But as we've already seen, they were not expecting resurrection to happen. And also, as we've said, they were willing to die for this belief in the resurrection. And if they had really known that Jesus hadn't risen from the dead, but was actually rotting in their attic upstairs, the truth would have come out pretty quickly. Once, instead of giving them fame, fortune, and position in society, it led to quite the opposite. Some people suggest, well, maybe it was hallucinations. This wouldn't account for the empty tomb. We'd still have to account for that. But it would perhaps account for the appearances of Jesus. Well, I was talking to a friend of mine, Glyn Harrison, who was professor of psychiatry at the University of Bristol. And I said to him, Glyn, do you think hallucinations could account for the kind of appearances that are documented by Jesus' followers? He said, the thing about hallucinations is they normally happen to individuals, not groups. They normally happen in one of our perceptive modes, a kind of a sight of a person in a crowd or a voice in a noise or whatever. They normally can happen for a long time and have a negative impact on people's mental well-being. But when it comes to the appearances of Jesus, they happen not just to individuals, but to groups. They are not just kind of a face in a crowd, but they see him and touch him and eat with him and meet with him. They happen for a set period of time with no repeats, and they have no negative impact upon their mental well-being. In fact, quite the opposite. It turns these timid people into bold witnesses who travel the Roman world and propagate this message at the risk of their lives. Hallucinations wouldn't account for that. So there's another argument, and that is that, or maybe Jesus actually rose from the dead. As difficult as that might seem to our 21st century rational minds, I would suggest that when we start to dig into the evidence, it's the argument that seems to make sense of it the best. And as we looked at lunchtime, there are many people who have approached the evidence with a high degree of skepticism, indeed seeking to try and disprove it, who have changed their mind in the light of it. Now, you might be saying tonight, yeah, but Michael, it is still too difficult for me to believe. I just can't believe that kind of stuff. It's just too big. Well, firstly, it is big. I grant that. But can I also suggest that none of us get away from having to believe big things? If you're going to reject the resurrection of Jesus because you don't believe that miracles are possible and you believe that we live in a rational universe that can be naturalistically explained, there are just other big things you're going to have to explain. Not how Jesus rose from the dead, but why did all of life come from nothing? Why did everything come from nothing? Why did order come from chaos? Why did minds come from unconscious matter? Those are big questions to ask. So at the end of the day, none of us get away from having to explain difficult things. I'd suggest actually when we start to look at the evidence, well, the resurrection starts to make sense of it. But you might say, well, what does it mean, though? What does it mean if Jesus rose from the dead? Well, we asked the question at the beginning, what if? What if there was more? What if we were made for more? And I'd say if Jesus rose from the dead, let me say this. Firstly, there's more to life than this life alone. There's more to life than this life alone. Because if Jesus rose from the dead, then the fact is that death isn't the end. It's not the end for Jesus, and it won't be the end for us. And that's worth thinking through, isn't it? Because if death isn't the end, of course the question is, what next? One of those other people who promoted this message of resurrection, the skeptic, Saul of Tarsus, who became a preacher, the Apostle Paul, was in Athens, the city of Athens, preaching about this message, and it's recorded in one of the other books of the Bible. And he says this: God has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he's appointed, and he's given proof of it to everyone by raising him from the dead. Paul says there is going to be a day in the future of justice. And the one who will bring about that justice is Jesus. Now, if that's true, that's great news, because actually there is going to be justice for our broken and messed up worlds. But also, if it's true, it's kind of scary news, isn't it? Because it means that all of us will stand before this Jesus too. And where will I be on that day if I've spent my life ignoring him and ruining his world and hurting others? As, in a sense, we all have to a degree. It is good news that there is more to life than this, and yet it raises sobering questions, doesn't it, about where we would stand if that were the case. But also, I want to say this. Because Jesus rose from the dead, that isn't something we have to fear. Last night, we looked at how Jesus' death on the cross makes forgiveness possible for those who have failed, and that's all of us. And the resurrection, in a sense, is the evidence that that claim is, well, it's true. Interestingly, back in that passage we read in chapter 16, when the angel appears to the women, he tells them to go and tell the disciples, the followers of Jesus, about it. And on page 44, I don't know if you noticed, he said, he is not here, he is risen. See the place where they laid him. Tell his disciples and Peter. Now, actually, it's kind of interesting, because Peter was one of the disciples. So they didn't need to say that. But the angels point out Peter particularly. Why Peter? Why is he mentioned by name? Well, if you'd read this story in its entirety, you'll know that Peter was the guy who blows it the biggest. He's the biggest failure. He's messed up big time. And what does the resurrection mean for failures, people who recognize they've blown it? It's great news. It wasn't go and tell Peter to watch out because Jesus is coming for you. Because actually, if you read one of the other biographical accounts, you'll realize what happened. Jesus came not to condemn him, but to forgive him and to welcome him. The resurrection is good news. It means we don't need to fear judgment to come. It means that we can know that Jesus' forgiveness is available to us and we can receive it. There's more to life than this life alone. But there's also, can I suggest, if the resurrection is true, more to life than this life now. More to life now if Jesus rose from the dead. You know, we said earlier that if death is the end, what's the point? What's the point of everything we do and achieve in life? But actually, as we looked at on Tuesday nights, if death is not the end, if the hope of the Bible is real, that one day there is resurrection to come, not just a spiritual dimension called heaven, but a restoration of everything, then actually the Christian faith says this life matters. All of it. Life is not some kind of moral test we simply have to pass so we can go to paradise. No, actually, all of life matters because one day God will restore and redeem all of life. And so all of life takes on a deeper significance and meaning when you know that there is more. There's more to life than this life alone. There's more to life now if Jesus rose from the dead. And there is hope if Jesus rose from the dead. Before I went to Edinburgh to study, I was working for a summer with a guy a bit older than me, and a guy called Barry. And when I got to college, I got a message from him to say that his wife, Paula, had been diagnosed with cancer. And she went for treatment, but sadly it got to a point where there was nothing else they could do. And she tragically died. And no one who went to her funeral will ever forget what happened. It was a small kind of village chapel. They lived in a village just outside our town. And as they brought the coffin into the church, of course everyone was there, her husband, her kids, parents, family, friends. As they brought the coffin in, a song was played over the loudspeakers in the church. And it was a song that was quite familiar to many people who went to the church. But everyone sat up and listened because the person who was singing the song was Paula, who was now in the coffin. And a few weeks before her death, knowing she was dying, she had recorded it and asked for it to be played at her funeral. And the last verse of that song contained these words: "No guilt in life, no fear in death. This is the power of Christ in me. From life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. And she sang those words, facing the prospect of her death, knowing that because Jesus had defeated death, there was more to life before and after. She had that confidence. And I guess my question is, do you have that confidence? Have you discovered that for yourself? You know, we've heard a lot this week, and maybe you're kind of thinking, well, what's my response to it going to be? And as Sharon said at lunchtime, we're all going to respond in some way. We're all going to make some kind of response, even if it's to say no to it. But actually, I'd really want to encourage us to consider, actually, based on all that we've heard this week, could there be something more? And if there is something more, what more are you going to do about it? There's a verse in the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, and it contains some words from the risen Jesus. Revelation chapter 3 says, "Here I am, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person and they with me." There was a painter called Holman Hunt who painted a picture. He actually painted two, and if you go to Keble College Chapel and go to the sides, you'll see one of them just down the road. Here's Jesus, the light of the world, standing, as it were, at the door. But not a physical door, of course, but a metaphorical door, the door of our lives. And he's knocking. Why? Because he's on the outside. But he wants to be on the inside. But why is he knocking? Because Jesus doesn't barge into our lives. We need to invite him in. And I guess my question is, have you ever invited Jesus into your life? Have you ever taken that step of opening the door? And if you've not, I guess my question is, what's keeping it shut? What bolts, what locks are keeping the door of your life shut to Jesus? It might be one of two. It might be doubt. You might be saying, yeah, but I'm just not 100% sure it's true. Well, that's probably the case. But in life, there are very few things that we are 100% sure about, are there? But it doesn't stop us from making rational decisions based on the weight of the evidence. Maybe you think, well, becoming a Christian would be like this, kind of a leap of faith into the unknown. But actually, what I've come to realize is that following Jesus isn't about a leap of faith. Think about some of the things we've looked at over the course of this week: the evidence for God, the reliability of the Bible and the New Testament, the way Christianity makes emotional sense, the evidence we've seen for the person of Jesus, the evidence for the resurrection as we thought about today, and the experience of other people who've discovered this life themselves, as we've heard about each night. You know, when you start to put it all together, you realize it's not a leap of faith, it's a step of faith. Yes, it's still an act of faith, but it's not irrational. It's based on so many things. And maybe as these things have started to come together this week, you're starting to realize actually it wasn't the leap that I thought it would be. And maybe you need to take that step. Maybe the other bolt, though, is fear. Maybe you're thinking, well, what would happen if I open the door to Jesus? And my answer to that question is, I don't know. Because it's about entering into a relationship rather than adopting a rule book. And when you start a relationship, you have no idea really how it's going to change your life, do you? But if it's a relationship with someone who loved you enough to die for you and is alive and available to be with you through life, death, and eternity, then can I suggest it's one that's worth it? Won't always be easy, but it will always be worth it. Maybe it's the fear of what other people would think if we suddenly got serious about this Jesus stuff. And perhaps for some of us, that's just fear of a bit of social kind of rejection. And in a sense, I kind of want to say, look, if it's true, so what? If this is true, go with it. Have the courage to go where the evidence leads. Maybe for others of us, it's bigger than that. It would be genuine rejection. And actually, for the first followers of Jesus, the cost of following him was big. But Jesus once said this. He said, the cost of not following me will be bigger, and the benefits of following me will outweigh anything you have to give up. It is worth it. So I guess my question is, if you've not opened the door, would you like to? I'm just going to finish this evening with a short prayer. And this is just for anyone who wants to do that. Maybe you're not at that position yet. Maybe you've still got significant questions that you need to look into. And that's totally fine. We'll have some Q&A later. But actually, for some of us, although we maybe haven't had all our questions answered, we think, actually, now we've come to a point, I know enough that I want to make that step. And so maybe you want to echo this in your hearts as a way of expressing that to God. If you're not ready to do that, it's just fine. Just listen, and in a moment, we'll move on. But for those for whom this would be helpful, then why not echo this in your hearts? God, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the way that I've often kept you out of my life. But thank you that you don't want to stay there. Thank you for what Jesus has done for me. Thank you that he died for me and he's alive and available to come into my life. God, please, will you come into my life now and help me to start living with you and for you from this moment onwards. And I pray this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.